Do you think that integration was the right move?
No, I don't. And I don't think it's actually that controversial.
It's always lovely when progressives try so hard to be woke that they accidentally sound like old-fashioned racists. We're going to break down the latest identitarian insanity from comedian turned political commentator Trevor Noah and so much more on today's episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast, my daily show where we take on the craziest ideas from across our media, our politics, and the internet, all from an independent perspective. Up first, we're going to dissect a clip from Trevor Noah's podcast where he's interviewing a Columbia professor, and they are very far left people. Trevor Noah, I personally just never really found funny. He came and did a gig when I was in college at UMass and just didn't hit for me at all. But his political commentary is also usually not something that resonates with me, to say the least. But even I was stunned by how extreme and kind of crazy this clip seemed. But once I explain it, it'll make more sense to you. But him and this far left professor he was talking to, somehow in the name of racial justice or something, ended up convincing themselves that integration, as in, the blending of the races as segregation was abolished, was actually a mistake. I know it sounds like I'm making that up or mischaracterizing something they said. Take a listen, though, for yourself.
I found myself wondering, and this applies to America, and then maybe it'll go to other places in a different way because Finland ties in. Do you think that integration was the right move? And now I'm separating two things because I know in America people are like, well, of course, there was racism and there was segregation. And I go, yeah, no. I'm separating them. Let's separate someone being oppressed and someone not being able to get a job and someone not being able to get a bank loan. Let's take all of those, the negative things away, because I'll put myself out personally and say, I think whether we're talking about gifted kids who are anomalous, let's say, to the norm, whether we are talking about and I mean anything that does not fit into a category. I think the part of the reason Finland is able to do it is because, have you been to Finland?
It's very homogeneous.
I've been to Finland. You know who's in Finland? Finnish people. That's it. And because they're all Finnish, there's an idea of no, we all head in the same direction. We all know what our actions mean. And that's a really powerful thing I've learned in communicating with other people. When I'm in a room with anyone where we start to tie together multiple things. So if I'm in a room with black people, already there's an implicit trust because we know what certain actions, words, and vibes mean. And then you're in a room with another African. Already. This person. Now, even if you shout at me, I know what your shout means. The same way an Italian knows what an Italian shout means. Yeah. Right? I know I'm prefacing it with a lot because it's a loaded question.
Yes.
But I would love to know if you think integration was the right solution, maybe, on the other side of, America, of civil rights.
Yeah. No, I don't. And I don't think it's actually that controversial when, if you understand that segregation and integration weren't the only options. Within those two options, it may seem like integration is the more progressive. Of course, we don't want segregation. But again, when you're being integrated into institutions, into a culture that's a supremacist culture, that's a culture that feeds off of hierarchy, that feeds off of insecurity, anxiety, why are we being integrated into that?
So there's a lot to unpack here, but a couple things came to mind. I forget, there's some quote about how some ideas are so stupid, only an intellectual could subscribe to them. And that's the kind of thought process I have when I see professors who are clearly studied and learned in many ways say absolutely insane and unhinged things. I think you have to just inhabit an echo chamber up in an ivory tower, spend so long poring over the same radical text that you just get distanced from the actual reality of the ideas you're talking about. Because, yes, integration was actually good and was the right move. And it is, in fact, controversial to suggest otherwise because racial discrimination is bad. The way Trevor Noah framed this doesn't even make sense. Separate the question of segregation from the racism and the discrimination. You can't really do that. That's part of it. Plus, there's this weird race essentialism and kind of identity maximalism to it. Like he's talking about, in a room full of other Black people, I just intrinsically have trust with them because we have this shared Blackness or what have you. That actually is strange to me. I actually don't get that. I certainly don't feel that way about other white people. I don't feel that way about gay people. Like that's almost a race essentialist view, in the same way that you have like literal white supremacists who think that who you are as a person and your trustworthiness and your competence and your merit is intrinsically bound up with your race, when it's not, right? Individuals, everyone's an individual, and things like skin pigment and genetic heritage are really not very relevant to who you are as a person, your character, your competence, and all of that. It almost sounds like he agrees with them in that sense, in a different direction, of course, and perhaps with better intentions, but basically the same idea. He's assigning trust to people based on their skin color, and they think that's woke. Like they think that's progressive. It's not. And I've said this for a long time, but there's something in politics called the horseshoe theory, where if you go far enough to the left and to the right, you end up kind of weirdly in the same place. And I think that happens a lot with the racial discourse and the identity politics discourse, that on one extreme, you have genuinely racist people. They're still out there. I see them all over X now, like what they call Twitter now. And ironically, they were loving this post. The anonymous frog accounts who love Nick Fuentes and whatever thought that Trevor Noah really ate with this, which should be a red flag in its own right. They're still there. I think they're not representative of a broad swath of the American public at this point in 2025. But then you have these kind of like woke identitarianist maximalists, and they end up in a similar place, honestly. When you go all in on the identity politics Kool-Aid, you end up sounding kind of like those hardcore racists in a different way, where you are essentializing people by their racial identity, and even seem to be suggesting like some form of separation. I don't know, they would call it segregation, but separation between races and groups as something progressive or liberal in any sense, when it's not. I mean, this is the phenomenon you see with the separate graduation ceremonies for Black people at universities happening now in the current day and age. But this time it's being done in the name of like Black and African American pride or something. That's actually not good. That's actually regressive. Now, obviously, it's done in a different spirit than old-fashioned segregation, but personally, and I think many others want to move to an America where these things fade into the background, where the differences between the races aren't stressed and emphasized at every turn, and eventually race becomes like hair color or eye color. But I think the progressive vision of these issues, the progressive take on, at least on the hardcore, actually makes that dream unreachable and means that it will never happen. And in that way is incredibly toxic and harmful if you're somebody who even believes in the Martin Luther King Jr. vision of racial harmony in America. But I think here's what distinguishes normal everyday Americans of different races from these kind of radical ideologues on the left, like Trevor Noah and like his guest, the Columbia professor, when she hints at, we don't want to integrate into a system, because she calls herself an abolitionist and they want to tear down a system. You see this with kind of the radical queer activists, right? They don't want to. Some of them were even against gay marriage because they're like, marriage is a racist patriarchal institution or whatever. It's like there are people who want to take the bones of our society and our country and believe that the core of it is good and that we just haven't lived up to it, and make it more inclusive of more people. Gay people, Black people, people of different races. That's the camp I've always fallen into, and I think most Americans still fall into. Then there are those who might kind of use the language of inclusion or diversity, but are really seeking to dismantle the foundations of our country. And at least in this case, are open about it. They might have better intentions in some cases than kind of the old-fashioned racists and segregationists and the people who fought to preserve slavery and all of that, but the vision they have for the world does have some commonalities with those types. And to me, it is repulsive and racist in its own right. Keeping in this vein, another clip is going viral right now of a Howard University professor giving his take on DEI and white people. Take a listen.
The ultimate DEI, in fact, the only diversity, equity, and inclusion concept that I acknowledge historically is whiteness. Because only in whiteness can you be thoroughly unqualified for your job, Madam Press Secretary, Secretary of Defense, National Intelligence Director, Health and Human Services, Secretary of the Treasury. Only in whiteness can you be thoroughly unqualified, but in the diversity of whiteness, you get the equity of being able to bring your incompetent ass into a position, and you are included. So the only DEI that I recognize is whiteness. But what you're talking about with us is simply making fairness. When they say DEI, what we mean by that is fairness. But when we say DEI, what we mean is whiteness. That's the only diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Wow. So there's a lot to unpack there. But first and foremost, his rant about whiteness was kind of unhinged and disturbing to me on a few levels. One of which, though, that was just comical is he lumped Director of National Intelligence in there, which he's referring to Tulsi Gabbard, who, one, is fairly qualified for that position, and two, isn't white. She's of Asian and Polynesian descent, but he's just lumping her in with whiteness willy-nilly. It's like, that's very sloppy. Same, he also mentioned Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He's perfectly qualified for that job. You could talk about whether or not someone like Pete Hegseth is truly qualified for to be, the head of the Pentagon, but those are political appointees, so qualifications in modern politics haven't necessarily been a point of emphasis. Biden put a politician in charge of HHS, somebody with no real health experience. So it's kind of a strange and strained example to be talking about political appointees as an example of whiteness, especially when you're listing people who aren't even all white. And I'm sorry, but again, academia, it's like they're so out of touch. If you think DEI is just about fairness, you haven't been paying attention. Equality of opportunity is what critics of DEI support and call for. The DEI establishment and DEI status quo has been a system where you can apply to elite colleges, and because of your two people with the same exact test scores and grades, one of one skin hue and one of another, one gets accepted and one doesn't. You can even have situations where an Asian person with hundreds of points higher on their SAT score versus a black person, and the black person gets in and the Asian person doesn't. This was extensively documented in the Harvard lawsuit with affirmative action. That is the kind of DEI stuff that people have a problem with. And spoiler alert, it is not fairness. It is the opposite of fairness. It's like when we saw public colleges just exposed, I talked about this on the show, for literally saying they won't consider white people for some jobs under DEI regimes. That is not fairness. I don't know how to explain to people who are this out of touch that if they just think DEI means equality or everybody's welcomed in, like, you've been living under a rock and you are putting up a total straw man and caricature of your own side and your position and totally just not getting the argument against the position that you're pushing. But other than that, though, you're doing amazing. What did you guys think of both of these wild clips? And what do you make of kind of the progressive fringe take on race in America today? Let me know in the comments, and do hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet. Up next, we got to check in on one of the worst journalists in America, former Washington Post token Republican, but she just lived out a long time ago, Jennifer Rubin, a columnist who recently went independent and now has a massive Substack following. Well, a clip of her is going viral where she had this to say about MAGA voters. Take a listen.
Okay. Why would ABC, Disney, the mouse, who has more money than God, settle with Donald Trump?
I honestly don't know.
I've asked, why would ABC? But people ask me all the time, why is the media so mamsy-pamsy? And there are two explanations. One is they are convinced that if they would just move a little bit to the right, all those MAGA readers out there, now you'll notice the contradiction in terms, MAGA readers would pick up the Washington Post and they would have more readers. What is the logical fallacy here? Yes, reader. And there is nothing that the Washington Post could possibly do that would have those people take out a subscription. But they're convinced they're in there someplace.
I hate everything about this so much. You have this lifelong mainstream media figure who, by the way, did a 180 on basically everything she believes. She was a Paul Ryan shill before Trump came along and full in on Republican Party platform and basically changed on all her beliefs because Trump broke her brain and drove her mad, saying that the media, the mainstream media, is not anti-Trump enough. Babe, what? Put down the crack pipe. You've had more than enough. I mean, I feel like we're not in the same reality. If you've been reading the Washington Post where she worked or watching CNN or MSNBC or following the New York Times or all this over the last 10 years and your takeaway is, well, they really haven't been tough enough on Trump. They really haven't gone hard enough against Trump. What? How does one even reach that take? Because just because they still try to occasionally have some different perspectives or some semblance of balance or introspection, you think they're in the tank for Trump or they're pandering to MAGA. And of course, the truly nasty bit about this that's just so disgraceful and out of touch and ridiculous is when she rants about how, well, MAGA voters don't read. It's a contradiction in terms. One, imagine thinking you are ever going to convince people or ever going to recruit people to your side. Your whole thing is hating Trump and wanting to be against him. And yet you're actively so toxic and nasty towards his supporters. Of course, they're only going to be defensive. They're never going to be open to your message. What are you doing? Just from a strategic, self-interested point of view, what you're doing makes absolutely no sense. All you're really doing is pandering to resistance libs, kind of giving them fan service and actually doing the cause you say you care about a huge disservice, which would be, convincing people not to support Trump. If that was actually your goal, I mean, you don't catch more flies with vinegar than you do with honey or whatever the saying is. That's obviously not the right approach. But more importantly, this is just like literally not true. First and foremost, Americans by and large don't read enough anymore. But MAGA reads plenty. The number of conservative authors and pundits who have best-selling books is enormous. I mean, publications like Breitbart, FoxNews.com, Washington Examiner, all sorts of right-of-center media outlets get millions and millions and millions of page views every single day. The Wall Street Journal editorial page is very conservative, has a very robust readership. Like, lots of Republicans and Trump supporters read plenty. It's just an asinine statement and comes off as so elitist and so condescending and so perfectly indicative of everything that is wrong with how the mainstream liberal media, who Jennifer Rubin just typifies, has handled this era of our politics. And frankly, like why we have Trump 2.0. It's because of this kind of elitism and doubling down on disdain for people. And like this has not worked and they still don't get it. And that just honestly kind of astounds me. In a similar vein, we've got a tweet that's popping off from our favorite member of Congress, Jasmine Crockett, the far-left Democrat. She writes, "This is a problem the Democrats have had. We've significantly underestimated how callous and selfish some people are. We've truly wanted to believe in the general goodness of humanity. The fact that people are okay with losing their jobs and healthcare, going into a Trump-induced recession, not being safe, all in hopes that someone else will be hurt, is wild. Actually, it's downright satanic, but this is where we are in this country." This woman has lost the plot. She actually thinks that, like, people who disagree with her are just selfish and actively don't care if everything gets worse in their lives as long as other people are hurt. It couldn't possibly be that they earnestly believe Trump is going to be better for the economy or that we need to secure the border to keep people safe. No, it must be that they think he's going to cause a recession and don't care because at least they'll get to see minorities suffer. How out of touch, how insulated from everyday Americans do you have to be to actually believe that that is a representative portion of Trump voters whatsoever, how they think or how they see the world? Like, I'm here in Michigan. I know a lot of people who voted for Trump. I know a fair number of people that voted for Harris as well, but I know a fair number of people who voted for Trump, and not one of them did it because they want to see other people suffer. That is just such a pessimistic and insane worldview. Like, obviously, that's not true about people who voted for Kamala either. Most of them earnestly care and think they need to protect abortion rights, or they're worried about Trump being a threat to democracy or other things. And whether you agree with them or not, most of them earnestly have the best interests of the country in mind. They're voting with what they think is best for our future. And for a sitting member of Congress to be so incredibly out of touch with the country she is supposed to be serving is remarkable. And this, to be calling it satanic is just wild to me. It's actually wild. I actually think Jasmine Crockett is playing a character. I think she's actually remarkably intelligent and articulate, and simply purposefully speaks in a way that is dumbed down and is intentionally simplistic and crude because it gets her attention. It makes her, the controversial one, the fighter, or whatever. It gets her booked on media because they know she'll say something spicy that will get their show clipped up and shared. It really is kind of part of an incentive structure and revolving door of political commentary and news that I think is broken and incentivizes the worst from our elected officials. And she just so perfectly exemplifies that. She's increasingly become one of my least favorite people in American politics. And that's saying something. What do you guys think of all this? Let me know in the comments. Up next, we got to talk about one of the left's biggest lies about Trump that just imploded before our eyes. So you might remember this, and I encountered it at every turn, online, in the media, even in commercials that were spammed to me on my television and my YouTube because I'm in Michigan. All over and over and over again, Democrats and liberals and progressives told us that Donald Trump would ban IVF. Something, Project 2025, he'll ban IVF, over and over and over again. Meanwhile, in reality, Trump was saying, no, I love IVF, I'm going to make it free. IVF, if you don't know, is the reproductive technology that helps people who are having fertility issues conceive, or people who use IVF through surrogacy have a child. It's a pretty actually expensive but fairly widespread technology in use at this point, including by a lot of Republicans and people who are pro-life, though some true diehard pro-lifers have ethical issues with it. Anyway, he's actually all in pro-IVF, but they kept saying, no, he's lying. He's actually going to ban it because that's what it says in Project 2025. And I rolled my eyes at them. I said, come on, he's not going to do that. That's not a thing. But they told me over and over again, this was the thing. And now he's in office and he has moved to ban IVF. Just kidding. He's done the opposite and just signed an executive order seeking to expand accessibility and affordability for IVF services for all Americans. Now, to be clear, this executive order doesn't do a ton because you need Congress to actually spend money. So it's a largely symbolic and recommendation-based executive order. It's entitled Fact Sheet President Donald Trump expands access to in vitro fertilization, IVF. It reads, the order directs policy recommendations to protect IVF access and aggressively reduce out-of-pocket and health plan costs for such treatments. So like I said, it's largely policy recommendations because there's not a ton he can actually do via executive action. But again, not the actions of a man who will ban IVF, as we were told over and over again. Here's a Kamala ad that they spammed at us in Michigan.
And I are going through IVF treatments now. It could be our only chance to have a family. But Donald Trump could ban IVF in some states. My husband is in the military. He volunteered to serve. We are patriots and we go where he is assigned. What if we end up in a state where IVF is no longer legal? What will we do then?
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message.
Donald Trump, understand, he's not done. He would ban abortion nationwide. He would restrict access to birth control, put IVF treatments at risk, and force states to monitor women's pregnancies. Just Google Project 2025. Just Google it.
Guys, that was just 5 months ago that ad was being run, and this was being pushed nonstop. But it was, as I knew then, but as hopefully you can all see now, utter propaganda and lies. And they just can't help themselves. They do this about Donald Trump all the time. There's so many actual things that are controversial or that they could criticize him about, but instead they just have to lie and hyperventilate and push this catastrophic nonsense. But political campaigns lie, right? Like, I'm sure Trump put out some ads that were misleading or not true in different ways as well. I don't know. But that's not exactly, shocking. Oh, politician's campaign puts out false ad. But this wasn't just coming from the Kamala campaign. This was like a widespread Democrat talking point. Hillary Clinton tweeted, Trump and Project 2025 want to ban abortion, end IVF, monitor women's menstrual cycles, and more. The Democrats' official account tweeted, the only candidate running for president of the United States who will protect IVF is Vice President Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris tweeted, Donald Trump's Project 2025 agenda could effectively ban IVF, preventing families like Yesenia and her husband from their chance to have a child. Joe Biden tweeted, Republicans led by Donald Trump are threatening access to abortion, contraception, and IVF. Tim Walz posted, even if you've never gone through the hell of infertility, someone you know has. When Gwen and I were having trouble getting pregnant, the anxiety and frustration blotted out the sun. J.D. Vance opposing the miracle of IVF is a direct attack on my family and so many others. Meanwhile, everyone's favorite TikTok propagandist Harry Sisson tweeted, WTF, Donald Trump's press secretary was asked if Trump would protect IVF access and she refused to answer the question. She won't say if he'd sign a law to protect IVF or not. It's insane. This is the Republican Party. They want to control women. So how'd all that age? It aged like milk, It's just so important to realize that so many of the narratives that you are hearing coming from political campaigns or coming from politicians on either side of the aisle aren't based in truth. They're not based in research. They're based in focus groups and poll testing, where they have researched and seen not what messages, they don't care if it's true or not, but what messages resonate with people. So they understand that a lot of people very strongly care about IVF because a lot of people's families were only made possible because of IVF. Like a very surprisingly high percentage of people have had to use this technology. And so they knew that going after it could stir people's emotions, could pull at their heartstrings. And so they're like, yeah, who cares that it's not true, that it's the opposite of what Trump says his position is. We'll just run with it. We'll repeat it over and over again. And if you just repeat it enough times, people start to believe it, even if it's totally untrue. I mean, Trump has done this with various things, like Mexico was never going to pay for the wall, folks. But it's just such an important reminder to you guys to not believe just the claims you see made on TikTok, not believe the things you see in political ads that are being spammed at you by targeting to your state or whatever, and to always do your due diligence, always have critical thinking, and not just buy narratives just because people repeat them over and over again. And I again think there's just not enough accountability in our politics and in our media for people who get things totally horribly wrong. Like so many people who just completely pushed fake narratives with devastating consequences, everything from, there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq to even less consequential things like Trump is going to ban IVF. There's just never any consequences for people in politics and media who say things. It's because of the 24-hour news cycle or whatever. People move on so quickly, but actually people should be held accountable for the wild, untrue claims and predictions they make. But it very rarely happens, unfortunately. You guys think, did you actually fall for that propaganda? I don't blame you if you did. It was pretty unrelenting. Do let me know in the comments. All right, guys, that's it for today's episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Please do make sure to subscribe if you aren't yet. Do hit that like button before you go. Remember to check out the merch store, linked in the description, and we will talk again real soon.